They threw me into a nursing home like I was insane. My own son did that. They called me a burden. They laughed, thinking I was useless. But I wrote down every one of their lies and turned that notebook into a sentence. If you think this is just another ordinary family drama, think again. Subscribe now to catch more of our gripping story films coming soon. Under the golden hues of a Charleston morning, the ivy-laced mansion on Rutledge Avenue shimmered like a photograph frozen in time, stately, silent, immaculate. The manicured lawn bore no trace of turmoil, no signs of unease. But within its ivy-covered walls, Margaret Nolan moved like a ghost. At 73, she had mastered the art of silence. Her hands, once animated with the authority of a seasoned professor, now gently cradled a rusted watering can. She crouched by the hydrangeas lining the garden path, her joints stiff but movements precise. Every bloom was given attention. She spoke to no one, though her lips moved slightly, as if whispering to the flowers, the only things in the house that still listened without judgment. Through the grand windows above her, shadows crossed the curtains. Her son's voice, distant but familiar, murmured something sharp-clipped. Then Victoria's voice, rising a decibel too high, dissolved into laughter, casual and cutting. Margaret looked up briefly, squinting through the morning glare, and returned to the soil. Inside, the scent of lemon polish clung to the floors, and the ticking of a vintage grandfather clock sliced through the stillness. Margaret stepped into the library next a room she once considered her cathedral. Dust had settled on her old philosophy books, Arendt, Camus, Kierkegaard, now reduced to decor. She picked up a leather-bound copy of The Republic, brushed its cover gently, and placed it back exactly as it was. Not a page turned, not a spine bent. She knew her place, and it was not here. Upstairs, the conversation between Owen and Victoria had shifted to the upcoming foundation gala. Margaret paused at the foot of the staircase, but chose not to ascend. Her presence upstairs was tolerated, not welcomed. Instead, she walked into the dining room to prepare the morning table, carefully laying out the silverware, adjusting the napkin folds to triangular perfection. The kind of discipline one retains when their voice no longer matters. The morning passed in muted rituals until lunchtime, when Victoria floated into the room like a breeze carrying perfume and passive aggression. "Did you remember to take your pills this morning, Margaret?" she asked, smiling but not kindly. Margaret's fingers, steady despite the question's sting, continued to pour tea. "I don't take any pills, Victoria. Haven't for years." "Oh, my mistake," Victoria replied with faux innocence, glancing at Owen, who had just entered, face buried in emails on his phone. Margaret caught the quick look between them. Not a glance, but an agreement. A tiny handshake in the air. Owen sat at the head of the table as he always did, a position that once belonged to Margaret's late husband. His eyes remained fixed on his phone. "How are the hydrangeas?" he asked absently, not looking at her. "They bloom despite the neglect," Margaret replied softly but deliberately. "They always do." Victoria arched a brow but said nothing. Lunch was a quiet affair, punctuated only by the clinking of forks and the occasional low hum of air conditioning. The roast chicken was perfectly done. Margaret had spent 2 hours marinating it the night before, but no compliments came. They ate like residents of a well-run hotel, politely, independently, and with a strange sense of obligation. It was halfway through Victoria's second glass of white wine that she spoke again. "I heard from the Grantworth Foundation this morning," she said casually, running her finger around the rim of the glass. "Looks like we'll be receiving another installment of the education grant." Owen looked up, finally interested. "Really? That was quick. I thought they were tightening funds this quarter." "Oh, they are. But I took care of it." Victoria waved a hand like she was shooing away a bug. "You just have to know how to package the application. Tug at the right heartstrings." Margaret set down her fork, slowly, precisely, her eyes sharp as ever moved between them. "What did you mean by tug at the right heartstrings?" she asked, the edges of her voice worn smooth by age but still firm. Victoria didn't even blink. "Oh, you know. Say the right things. Sad single moms promising inner-city youth. Whatever fits the mold. We made some tweaks to the student bios. Tweaks! Margaret repeated the word, tasting foul. Owen gave a small cough and reached for the bread basket. It's just presentation, Mom. Nothing illegal. Victoria's a genius at shaping narratives. That's why the board loves her. Margaret turned to him, a slow and deliberate pivot of her frail frame. And does that include creating people who don't exist, or giving them test scores they never earned? The room went still. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Margaret, she said with deliberate sweetness, are you implying something? Margaret held her gaze. I'm asking a question. Owen raised both palms. Let's not do this. It's been a long week. Everyone's tired. No, Owen. Margaret said now, visibly trembling, not from fear, but fury contained. I've read those bios. I've seen the same quote attributed to 4 different students. You're funneling money based on false records. That's not shaping a narrative. That's fraud. Victoria exhaled sharply, setting down her wine glass with a little too much force. This is exactly what I meant, she said, turning to Owen. She's starting again, with the paranoia, the accusations. I'm not paranoid, Margaret snapped, and the room jumped. It was the first time her voice had risen in months. Victoria folded her arms. You know what? Maybe it's time we talk to Dr. Templeton again. You remember him, don't you? The neurologist. Margaret stood up slowly, but with purpose. Don't you dare twist this into some memory issue. My mind is sharper than either of yours, and I will not be gaslit into silence. Victoria's expression shifted, from mock concern to calculated calm. Of course not, Margaret, she said. We're all just worried about you. Owen stared at his plate, jaw clenched. His silence was more violent than shouting. Margaret looked at her son, the boy she had raised on Nietzsche and Neruda, who once wept over dead birds, and asked her what it meant when someone disappeared. That boy was long gone, replaced by this polite coward in a suit. You used to be brave, she said to him, voice cracking. He didn't respond. She left the dining room, leaving behind half a plate of food and an air thick with things unsaid. Back in her quarters, a converted guest suite tucked behind the kitchen, Margaret sat down at her writing desk. The drawers were mostly empty now. Just a few envelopes, some pens, and an old spiral-bound notebook. She opened it and turned to a blank page. She wrote only one sentence. They have begun to erase the truth, and they expect me to forget it existed. She closed the notebook gently, and for the first time in months locked her door from the inside. Under the gentle flicker of a brass reading lamp, Margaret Nolan sat alone in the once sacred library of the Charleston estate. The room, lined wall to wall with books she had curated over a lifetime, now felt like a mausoleum hollow, stripped of its purpose. It had been weeks since anyone else had even stepped foot in there. Owen avoided it altogether, and Victoria treated it like a warehouse of irrelevance. But tonight the stillness carried weight. It wasn't just a place of memory anymore. It was about to become a crime scene. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the antique cabinet, the one where her late husband used to store tax documents and foundation correspondence. Victoria had been using it lately, or rather storing her official files there under the assumption that Margaret no longer paid attention. But she did. Every closed drawer, every misfiled folder, every innocuous "Mom, you don't need to worry about this" had planted seeds in Margaret's mind. Tonight those seeds were blooming. She slipped on a pair of thin cotton gloves, an old academic habit to preserve paper integrity, and carefully began scanning the files. The first few folders appeared mundane donation receipts, school brochures, meeting minutes. But the 6th folder, marked Outreach Disbursements Q2, caught her eye. Inside, she found a ledger listing over 24 names, each associated with generous funding allocations. Names of supposed scholarship recipients. But 3 of those names struck her instantly, because they weren't real. Those 3 students were fabrications Margaret herself had created as case studies in her curriculum writing days. Pseudonyms meant for classroom exercises. No one else was supposed to know them. But here they were on an official disbursement form, listed as real beneficiaries of thousands of dollars. Her fingers froze over the paper. She turned to another folder marked Preliminary Q3 Submissions. This one contained bios, short narratives, academic histories, heart-tugging blurbs, almost poetic in their emotional manipulation. One paragraph described a high school senior named Khalil, an orphan raised by his grandmother who had scored in the top 1% of national math exams. It sounded noble. Except Margaret recognized the quote in the final sentence. It was lifted word for word from a journal article she'd published 20 years ago. The entire thing was a Frankenstein creation false identity stitched together with bits of stolen language and data. Margaret's breath quickened. Her palms began to sweat inside the gloves. The facts weren't just inconvenient anymore. They were illegal. She scribbled notes furiously in her notebook, names, amounts, dates. She drew lines across the page linking the forged bios to the real students who had been denied funding. Then in the right-hand margin, she wrote one word, motive. As the clock in the hallway chimed midnight, she returned the folders exactly as she found them and turned off the library lights. But she didn't go to bed. Not yet. Later that night, as rain began tapping against the stained glass windows, Margaret heard voices from upstairs. Low, urgent. Not the casual nighttime murmur of spouses. Something deliberate, something hidden. She stepped lightly into the hallway and leaned near the foot of the stairs, just out of sight. Her head tilted to catch the vibrations of their voices. Victoria's tone was sharp, clinical. "No, listen, he's asking for another 25 before end of month. I told him we'd adjust the bios. No, the board doesn't cross-check those numbers, and if they do, the foundation's in on it anyway." There was a pause, footsteps, a floorboard creaked overhead. "No, Margaret, she's harmless. She's half senile and obsessed with her old books. The only thing she's a threat to is her own blood pressure." Margaret stood motionless, hands gripping the wooden banister. Her jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. "Just keep the transfers split across the accounts," Victoria continued. "It looks cleaner that way. And for God's sake, make sure the bios don't repeat too much." She noticed the overlaps before. "I won't have that happen again." A door closed. Silence reclaimed the house. Margaret walked back to her room like a woman returning from war. Her knees ached and her hands trembled, but her mind buzzed like a conductor's rail. She opened her notebook again. This time she listed everything she'd heard, word for word. Paused mid-sentence, rewrote phrases to check accuracy. The notes filled 3 pages. She didn't sleep. The next morning the sun pierced through the blinds, mocking the dread in her chest. Breakfast was served with polite stiffness. Margaret sipped her tea quietly, her eyes rarely leaving Victoria, who looked radiant in a lemon silk blouse, laughing at something on her phone. Margaret waited until Owen came down. When he finally joined them, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to speak with both of you." Victoria looked up, arching an eyebrow. Owen, half awake, blinked at his mother. Margaret placed a folder on the table. It wasn't the original evidence. She wasn't reckless. Just a sample. 2 forged bios, 2 pages from the funding ledger. A post-it note labeled duplicated identities. Victoria didn't touch it. "What's this supposed to be?" "A mistake," Margaret said, her voice calm but unyielding. "One you both made, repeatedly. These profiles are fabricated, the quotes are plagiarized, and the funds they're being laundered through fake recipients." Victoria's expression didn't change. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs slowly. "Are you accusing us of something?" "I'm asking for an explanation," Margaret replied, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. Owen finally spoke. "Mom, come on. These are program documents. You're not involved in this stuff anymore. You're jumping to conclusions." Margaret locked eyes with her son. "I didn't jump. I listened. I read. I verified. These aren't conclusions, Owen. These are facts." Victoria let out a short laugh, sharp and sterile. "So you were snooping and eavesdropping. That's rich. It's called being vigilant." "No," Victoria said, her voice cool. "It's called being paranoid." Margaret's hands were folded on the table, her nails dug into her own skin to keep from shaking. "You're stealing money meant for real students. You're committing federal fraud." Owen rubbed his temples. "Mom, please. Don't turn this into another thing. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe this is just confusion." "Don't patronize me," Margaret snapped. "This isn't about confusion. It's about accountability. You're not just lying, you're exploiting." Owen looked at Victoria for help, but she didn't blink. "I think we should schedule an appointment," she said, turning to Owen. "Dr. Templeton might help clarify some of this." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Who is Dr. Templeton?" "A neurologist," Victoria said smoothly. "He specializes in cognitive decline." Margaret felt a slow burn crawl up her spine. "You want to declare me senile," she said. It wasn't a question. No one said that, Owen murmured, not meeting her eyes. Victoria stood brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. "We just want to make sure you're healthy, that your memory's intact. You've had some episodes lately, forgetting things, making wild assumptions." "I haven't forgotten a damn thing," Margaret growled. "I remember every word of that phone call, every fake name, every lie, and you will not gaslight me out of my own mind." But Victoria wasn't listening anymore. She had already opened her laptop and started typing. Margaret looked at Owen again, searching his face for something remorsed out, hesitation, anything human, but all she saw was fear. Not fear for her, fear for himself, and with that Margaret knew she was alone in this fight. Back in her room that afternoon, she locked the door and started a new notebook. The other one was compromised. Someone had gone through her drawers, she was sure of it. This one would be hidden better. She titled it in bold block letters, "Timeline of Fraud, V&O Nolan." She underlined it twice. Outside, the Charleston sun burned brightly, blinding in its apathy. But inside, Margaret was sharpening her weapon the only way she knew how, with truth documented and relentless. They thought they could bury her under age, under silence, under soft smiles and institutional gaslighting. They were wrong. The air in the sunroom was too sweet, artificially floral, like the scent pumped into hotel lobbies to mask something rotting beneath. Margaret sat stiffly in the high-backed armchair, her hands folded on her lap, knuckles white with tension. Opposite her sat a man with salt and pepper hair and a gentle expression that didn't fool her for a second. Dr. Leonard Templeton, neurologist, hired assassin of sanity cloaked in clinical warmth. Between them, a clipboard rested on a mahogany table. Beside it, a cup of tea Margaret hadn't touched. "Shall we begin, Mrs. Nolan?" he asked softly, as though afraid she might shatter like porcelain. She lifted her chin. "Only if you stop calling me Mrs. I've been Margaret for 73 years. I don't intend to change that now." He smiled like someone checking a box. "Of course, Margaret." She already hated him. For the next hour, he asked questions. Easy ones at first. Date, year, current president. Then trickier ones, word recall, visual spatial puzzles, metaphor interpretation. Margaret answered each with curt precision. Her mind, though wearied from sleepless nights and betrayal, was still sharper than most people's at any age. But she could feel the trap tightening. She could see it in the way he wrote down hesitant when she paused to adjust her glasses. How he noted confused tone when she questioned a badly worded instruction. Every tick, every blink, every breath was an opening for him to insert doubt. When it was over, he stood, extended a hand she didn't take. "We'll be in touch soon," he said. "I'm sure you will," she replied coldly. "After you've spoken with my jailers." Owen was waiting outside the room, eyes darting nervously between her and the doctor. Margaret brushed past him without a word. 2 days later, she was summoned to the drawing room. Victoria was already there, legs crossed, neatly sipping from a wine glass, though it was barely noon. Owen stood by the fireplace, arms folded, a folder in hand. "Mom," he began, his voice trembling with forced calm, "we've spoken with Dr. Templeton." Margaret sat down, not because she was invited, but because she refused to be spoken to standing up. "Of course you have," she said. "That's what you paid him for." Owen flinched. "He's concerned about early signs of cognitive decline. Short-term memory lapses, paranoia, disorganized reasoning." "Because I questioned your crimes," Margaret snapped. "Because I refused to let you lie to my face and pretend it's rain when it's piss." Victoria smirked behind the rim of her glass. Owen stepped forward, holding out a document. "This is a consent form. It authorizes a short-term stay at a wellness facility, somewhere peaceful, just for observation." "I'm not signing anything." "You don't have to," Victoria said smoothly. "You already did." Margaret froze. "What?" Victoria set down her glass and opened her clutch, pulling out a single sheet of paper with a signature at the bottom. "I asked you to sign it 3 days ago," she said. "You thought it was a shipment receipt for your vitamins. but it was the intake consent. Margaret's eyes burned. "You tricked me." Victoria shrugged. "No, Margaret. I simply made things easier for everyone." Owen looked away. Margaret rose from her chair, slow but steady. "You are kidnapping me." "No one is kidnapping you," Owen said, stepping closer. "You need help. You've been confused, angry, accusing us of things that make no sense." "I wrote it all down," she hissed. "I documented everything. You can't erase it. You can't silence me." "No," Victoria said, cool as steel, "but we can make sure you get rest. Somewhere you can't keep hurting yourself." There was a knock on the front door. Margaret's heart dropped. 2 paramedics entered, professional, polite, and perfunctory. One of them held a stretcher. The other carried a clipboard. "She's ready," Victoria said, like they were collecting a package. Margaret backed toward the hallway. "Don't you dare touch me. I'm not going anywhere." Owen's face twisted with shame as he stepped forward. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be." "You're making it harder. You're tearing your own mother out of her home like a criminal." A tear slipped from her cheek, but her eyes never wavered. "I changed your diapers," she whispered. "I stayed up nights when you couldn't breathe. I taught you what justice meant." He wouldn't meet her gaze. The paramedics were gentle but firm. They held her arms, guided her to the stretcher. Margaret fought, kicking, screaming, cursing through tears. Her voice was raw, primal cracking as she shouted his name. Owen said nothing. As they wheeled her out, Margaret looked up one last time at the staircase, the place where she once read "To Kill a Mockingbird" aloud to Owen at 7 years old, where he used to run down barefoot, giggling in his pajamas. Now he stood silent, motionless. And Victoria. She stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, a satisfied smile curling at her lips like a snake basking in the sun. The ambulance door shut with a finality that echoed louder than any scream. The Rolling Pines. Senior Wellness Center looked like a country inn at first glance. White walls, flower boxes under the windows, winding gravel paths. But it smelled like Clorox and resignation. Margaret was admitted as a precautionary cognitive support case. She was given a modest room with a single bed, a nightstand, and a view of the courtyard where strangers sat quietly watching birds they couldn't name anymore. The nurses were kind, but kindness meant nothing when you were imprisoned behind polite eyes. For days, she refused to speak. She did not join group activities. She did not eat with the others. She sat by her window, writing in the only notebook she managed to smuggle under her coat. The entries were sharp, exacting. Day 1. I am not broken. I am buried. Day 3. They drug the tea, mild but enough to slow the brain. I will no longer drink it. Day 5. Victoria lied to the doctor. Owen said nothing. Silence is complicity. On day 6, a young nurse named Marisol entered with a fresh set of towels and lingered by the bookshelf. "You read Kant?" she asked, glancing at the only book Margaret had requested. Margaret looked up slowly. "Kant reads me." Marisol grinned. "Good answer." She didn't press further. She didn't patronize. She simply left the towels and walked away. But something in that exchange lit a tiny flame in Margaret's chest. Proof that she still existed, that she was still sharp, still her. That night she opened the back pages of her notebook and made a new list. Phase 1, document every memory, every name, every amount. Phase 2, smuggle copies out. Lawyer Halbert. Phase 3, survive, reclaim voice, destroy silence. Her fingers trembled not from age but purpose. The next morning she asked the nurse for more paper. They handed her a blank journal. She filled 5 pages before breakfast. And so it began. Not a breakdown, not a descent into madness, but a resurrection. 1 word at a time. The pen scratched against the lined page like a whisper in the dark. Each letter bled onto the paper with quiet defiance ink, becoming her only voice in a world that had stolen every other. Margaret sat hunched beneath the amber glow of the bedside lamp, its worn lampshade casting long shadows across her modest room at Rolling Pines. The night was silent save for the occasional soft hum of wheels rolling down the hallway, nurses changing shifts, distant coughs muffled behind closed doors. But here in this tiny sanctuary of paper and ink, Margaret Nolan was not silenced. She was strategizing. March 2nd, 11:48 p.m. Subject Victoria Nolan. Voice heard in conversation with unidentified male. Terms used allocation control split between accounts and create backfill narrative. Likely reference to falsified student files submitted to Grantworth Foundation. Verify with bios dated February 14th. She paused, eyes narrowing behind her bifocals. She flipped back 3 pages, cross-referencing phrases, marking patterns. She underlined a sentence from a week prior, then drew an arrow in red ink, used same quote for Khalil Y. as Maria B. Page 9 of funding file. It was methodical, surgical. She wasn't journaling, she was constructing a legal minefield step by step, lie by lie. Every page of her notebook held tightly structured entries, names, timestamps, overheard dialogue, suspicions with annotations, paraphrased phone calls from upstairs behaviors, emotional shifts, even estimates of wire transfers based on Grantworth press release dates. She annotated when Victoria laughed too long, when Owen didn't answer his phone for 2 days, when they left early and came back late. Margaret, reduced to a shadow, had become the house's most acute observer. But a plan was only as strong as its outlet, and in this place every channel was blocked. Until Clara DeSantos had worked at Rolling Pines for just under 6 months. She was 28, kind-eyed, fast-moving, and soft-spoken. Unlike most staff, she didn't treat Margaret like a patient. She asked about books. She noticed details. It started with a look. One afternoon, as Clara refilled Margaret's water pitcher, she saw a corner of the notebook poking from beneath the pillow. Their eyes met, and Clara's brow furrowed not in suspicion but recognition. She didn't ask questions. She didn't mention it to anyone. She simply poured the water, smiled, and left. The next day she returned during afternoon rounds. She glanced around the room, then leaned in. "I used to keep a journal, too. When I was helping my grandmother fight her guardianship case, they said she was unstable." She hesitated. She wasn't. She was just angry. Margaret looked up from her chair, her voice quiet. "They confuse the two, don't they?" Clara nodded, on purpose. There was a long pause. Then Margaret held out a sealed envelope, her hand shaking just slightly. "I need this mailed, no return address." Clara didn't ask what was inside. She tucked the envelope into the side pocket of her scrubs, nodded once, and left without another word. That night Margaret wept not from sadness but relief. The war had begun, 2 states away in a quiet brownstone in Alexandria, Virginia. Halbert Winchell stared at the envelope like it was a ghost. He hadn't heard from Margaret Nolan in over a decade. They had met when she was still a professor, a firebrand in torts and ethics law, and he a litigator with a taste for the impossible. She had referred students to him, argued policy with him. Once they'd almost co-authored a paper together until life and time got in the way. Now the envelope sat on his desk, postmarked from Charleston. No return name, no message. Just 25 pages of handwritten notes, each line more damning than the last. He read every word twice. The structure was precise. The language unmistakably Margaret's elegant but razor-sharp. The entries were dated, cross-referenced. There were attached names of grant officers, numbers of fake student IDs, specific accounts of overheard conversations with Victoria Nolan and other unnamed collaborators. And there were details, too many for coincidence. Halbert didn't sleep that night. He spent the dark hours pulling tax filings from public databases, reviewing Grantworth Foundation's last 2 quarterly summaries, scanning old press releases. Everything lined up, dates, dollar amounts, the supposed recipients, many of them ghost profiles. He poured himself a scotch at 4 a.m, hands still trembling. "This isn't paranoia," he muttered to himself. "It's a goddamn blueprint." The next day he made 3 phone calls, one to a private investigator in Charleston, one to a former contact at the DOJ, and one to a tech-savvy grad student intern named Chelsea, who owed him a favor. Within 72 hours he had corroborated 5 of Margaret's entries. By day 4 he was convinced. By day 5 he was preparing a case file. Back at Rolling Pines, Margaret continued writing with almost monastic discipline. Mornings were for analysis, afternoons were for narrative clarity, evenings were for memory recall. She organized each section of the notebook like a legal brief. She included citations, emails. She remembered meetings that occurred, phrases that reappeared. When she wasn't writing, she was thinking, strategizing. At night, she read the Psalms, not because she believed, but because their cadence soothed her. In the margins of her Bible, she scribbled cross-references to betrayal and justice. She no longer joined the others in communal activities. Her room became her fortress, her war room. Each time Clara entered, Margaret handed her another envelope. Each time Clara said nothing. She simply nodded and slipped them into her scrubs. On the 7th day, Margaret handed over a sealed manila envelope labeled in her handwriting, "Chronological Evidence, for legal counsel only." Clara glanced at the label, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Is this going to be enough?" Margaret met her gaze. "It's not about enough," she said. "It's about truth and pressure, applied in the right places." Clara exhaled. "Then I'll deliver it." Margaret rested a hand on her arm. "I know you will." That night the narration began. Inside the notebook, Margaret wrote the prologue. "To whoever reads this, understand, I did not choose silence. It was imposed. But silence is not absence. It is pressure, waiting for release. And when it comes, it does not whisper. It erupts." She wrote with clarity, fire, and a sense of grim patience. Her voice, the one they tried to fracture, returned stronger with every paragraph. The camera of memory rolled and the story flowed. February 14th, 10:43 p.m. Heard Victoria refer to new bios being carbon copied from last year's file. Likely fabricated names. Same time, Owen referred to moving the pieces across the board. Chess metaphor. Strategy of displacement. February 15th. Package from Grantworth arrived. Unopened for hours. Victoria hid envelope after reading. Smirked when she saw me watching. February 17th. Email subject line visible from Victoria's iPad. EDU Aloki RSTR 003. Same structure as previous fraud case cited in Chronicle of Philanthropy 2021. Need Halberd to cross-verify. And so it went. Pages upon pages. Facts pinned down like moths on corkboard. Her handwriting grew steadier. Her spirit surged. In a dark office in Alexandria, Halberd leaned back in his chair as he received the latest parcel from Clara, now dubbed Courier 1 in his files. He opened it under lamplight and read the prologue. And for the first time in 10 years, he felt awe. This wasn't just evidence. It was testimony. It was literature. It was a battle cry sealed in ink. He called Chelsea. "I need those bios compared with the last 5 years of Grantworth applications. Every duplicate phrase, every reused quote, cross-match them with public school rosters." "On it," she replied. "You're not sleeping, are you?" "No," he said, "but I'm wide awake." Back at Rolling Pines, the yellow glow of Margaret's bedside lamp flickered faintly through the hallway as night deepened. She wrote long into the early hours. Her voice, now a quiet narration behind the pen, read aloud in her mind, as though preparing for someone else to speak it one day. "I do not seek revenge. I seek clarity. I do not want punishment. I want release. For every real student denied a future because my son chose reputation over reality, this is my penance and my resistance." She paused. The pen hovered. Then she wrote, "This is my declaration of war, signed in solitude under duress, but not in fear." Margaret Nolan set down her pen. She looked out into the dark courtyard, and she smiled. The battle had begun. The city of Charleston stirred beneath the amber sky of early morning, unaware that something long buried had begun to tremble from below. Beneath the polished floors, behind grant applications and gala invitations, under the hush of Southern charm and well-pressed suits, a crack had formed. Small, nearly invisible. But it was widening. Halberd Winchell stood at the steps of WCR Channel 9, Charleston's oldest news station. The same station that once aired Margaret Nolan's lectures on civic ethics during Public Education Reform Week in 1994. Funny how the wheel had turned. He tightened the knot of his coat as he approached the security desk. In one hand, a leather case. In the other, a certified letter from the South Carolina Bar Association confirming the chain of custody for every page of Margaret's notes. Legal proof, chain tight, not speculation documentation. The receptionist, a young woman with a clipboard and bored eyes, looked up. "I have a meeting with Olivia Quayle," Halberd said. Producer or reporter? Both. 10 minutes later, he was sitting across from Olivia, a woman in her 40s with the expression of someone who'd seen too many spin jobs and not enough truth. Her nails tapped the table as Halbert unfolded the documents in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "An instruction manual for laundering grant money through fabricated students." Her eyebrow arched, unimpressed. Then she read the first line. By the second page, she was silent. By the 10th, she said nothing for a long time. "These are... Who wrote these?" "Professor Margaret Nolan." Olivia blinked. "The Margaret Nolan. She's the source. The whistleblower." She was silenced, manipulated, institutionalized under false pretenses. But she didn't stop writing. Olivia lifted a page, eyes scanning a line aloud. February 14th, overheard. "Split the accounts. Don't repeat bios from last quarter. Just update names and photos." She looked up. "That's an exact quote." Halbert nodded. Cross-referenced, corroborated, matched against Grantworth's Q1 disbursements. "It's airtight." "Is she willing to go public?" "She doesn't have to, not yet. The material speaks for itself." Olivia exhaled. "Give me 24 hours. Halbert leaned back. "You have 12. The segment aired on the evening bulletin tucked discreetly between a weather forecast and a piece on the local high school's robotics team. It lasted 1 minute and 47 seconds. A calm, authoritative voice read from the teleprompter. "New information obtained by WCR News raises questions about potential fraud in a local educational foundation's grant application process. According to sources and preliminary documentation reviewed by legal counsel, several student profiles submitted for funding consideration appear to be duplicated or falsified. Names linked to disbursements have not been verified by Associated Public Records. An internal review has reportedly begun. More to come as the story develops." There were no names, no photos, just the facts. Teased. Planted, released like a quiet tremor beneath a city built on legacy and secrecy. But in the Nolan estate, the impact was seismic. Victoria dropped her wine glass. It shattered across the marble kitchen floor, the crimson Cabernet splattering like blood across white tile. Her eyes were wide-locked on the TV screen as the final line repeated, "Names linked to disbursements have not been verified." She turned slowly, hands shaking. "They know." Owen looked up from his phone, confused. "What?" She didn't answer. She rushed out of the kitchen down the hallway into the office where her laptop sat open. Owen followed his steps, heavy with dread. "What are you talking about?" Victoria was already clicking through her folders, breathing hard, fingers moving too fast. "It's on the news," she said. "The student files, the ghost names. Someone leaked it." Owen stood frozen in the doorway. "That's not possible. No one saw anything." "Well, someone did," she snapped. "They just went on air and told the whole damn city the applications are fake." "Did they say our names?" "No, but it's only a matter of time." Victoria opened her encrypted folder labeled innocently as Q4 Planning. Inside were dozens of Word documents, PDF attachments, spreadsheets, bios of non-existent students, emotional essays penned by her, quotes fabricated to sound real, receipts, internal notes. She started dragging them into the trash. Owen stepped forward. "Stop, wait, if they find out you deleted files." "They already have the files, Owen." He grabbed her wrist. "Deleting them now is obstruction." Her voice dropped into a whisper. "They can't prove it's us if it's gone." He let her go. Victoria closed the lid of the laptop, trembling. Owen rubbed his temples. No one knew about the bios, no one except... He paused. Victoria stared at him. "What?" He turned slowly. "My mother." Victoria's face went pale. "No," she said, "she's locked away." "Doesn't mean she can't write or talk." Victoria stepped back, shaking her head. She was incoherent. She was hallucinating. She was watching. They looked at each other. Then Victoria's face hardened. "We need to shut this down, fast." Margaret sat by the window in her room, the last embers of daylight casting golden streaks across the linoleum floor. The mail had just arrived. Clara knocked gently and slipped an envelope into her lap without saying a word. Her eyes said enough. Margaret opened it with steady hands. A single sheet, typed, crisp. "They heard you." It was unsigned, but the initials at the bottom, HW, were all the confirmation she needed. Her fingers curled around the paper. Her throat closed up. For a long moment she couldn't breathe, not from panic, but from release. For so long her words had vanished into a void. She had screamed in silence, scratched truth into paper like a prisoner recording history in the walls of her cell. And now it had reached the surface. She looked out at the courtyard where dusk settled like ash on the shoulders of the trees. The old man who always fed the pigeons had stopped. Even the birds seemed quieter tonight. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closing. Something inside her, buried deep for months, flickered back to life. Not hope, not yet, but heat, conviction, the unmistakable feeling of a storm that had waited patiently for its time to rise. She turned to her desk, pulled open the drawer, and took out the fresh notebook Clara had brought her last week. She opened to the first blank page and began writing, not in code, not in fear, but with full voice. If this is the beginning, then I will write louder. They wanted silence. They will get story. They wanted a victim. They will get witness. Miles away in a newsroom lit by caffeine and computer monitors, Olivia Quayle was already reviewing Halbert's latest batch of supporting documents. The story was no longer just about grant fraud. It was becoming about something bigger: elder suppression, institutional silencing, financial betrayal under the guise of family and care. She opened her email to draft the subject line of the next pitch to the station manager. Follow-up. Whistleblower identity. Confirmed. Elder institutionalized during fraud discovery. The engine had started. The first ripple had reached the surface, and beneath it the sea was shifting. The silence before a storm is never as quiet as people think. It hums. It crackles low and electric, vibrating under surfaces long mistaken for solid. And on the gray-skied morning when the FBI raided the Charleston office of the Nolan Foundation for Academic Enrichment, the air itself carried that buzz. In the span of 38 minutes, 4 government-issue SUVs rolled up outside the headquarters building, a sleek, glass-wrapped space Victoria had once called our intellectual temple. Agents in Navy windbreakers stormed through the lobby badges, out voices firm. No alarms, no guns drawn, just the cold, practiced rhythm of federal intervention. Inside, employees froze mid-keystroke. Hard drives were confiscated, desktops unplugged, paper files pulled from drawers like bones from graves. The agents moved with purpose. Their instructions had been precise. A full digital and physical sweep of all records dated within the last 4 fiscal quarters. Keyword filters, reallocation, student alias, split account, biovariation. Within 2 hours, 47 fabricated student profiles were in custody: names, photos, and award letters, each more fictional than the last. Beneath one file, labeled Jeffrey L. Resilience Case Study, was a metadata trail leading directly back to Victoria's personal laptop. That laptop, of course, was gone. So was she. Victoria Nolan had vanished. No calls, no texts. Her phone left behind in the glove compartment of her luxury SUV, which was discovered abandoned behind a shuttered gas station outside Savannah. Surveillance footage showed her boarding a bus at 3:12 a.m. heading west. She'd taken 1 suitcase and a passport. By the time Owen received the news, it was too late. He sat in the back office of their home, face-pale voice, flat phone pressed against his ear. She what he asked the detective. His free hand trembled. I don't know where she would have gone, he muttered. We were supposed to handle this together, but there was no we anymore. Victoria had always known how to choose self-preservation over sentiment. She didn't love the house, or Owen, or even the empire they'd built. She loved survival. And Owen Nolan, he was just collateral. He hung up the phone and slammed his fist against the mahogany desk. The sound echoed through the empty mansion like a shot. He'd seen the news, too. That evening, WKR ran a follow-up segment. The camera faded in from black, revealing anchor Olivia Quayle, flanked by graphics of manila folders and flashing headlines. Tonight, she began sources close to WCR. Confirmed that the federal investigation into fraudulent academic grant submissions is now linked to a prominent Charleston-based foundation whose co-directors are under scrutiny for the creation and submission of false student profiles. She turned slightly toward the second camera, her voice softened but only slightly. In a stunning development, Our team has obtained confirmation that the whistleblower responsible for initiating this investigation is none other than retired philosophy professor and former ethics lecturer, Dr. Margaret Nolan. The screen cut to a photo. It was an older image, Margaret standing in front of a chalkboard mid-lecture, hand raised, eyes focused. Behind her, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Truth even in silence is not defeated." Back in her room at Rolling Pines, Margaret stared at the television. She said nothing. Clara stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You knew this would happen," Clara whispered. Margaret shook her head. "I didn't dare hope." On screen, Olivia continued. Dr. Nolan, currently residing in a senior wellness facility, reportedly provided investigators with over 100 pages of first-hand documentation detailing inconsistencies in disbursement records and internal correspondence. The Department of Justice has confirmed that her testimony and documents have been entered into the federal evidence system. Margaret looked down at her hands, wrinkled, veined, spotted with time, and closed her eyes. For months she had been erased. Now the world was remembering. At Rolling Pines, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The next morning in the dining hall, a group of residents paused their conversation when Margaret entered. One of them, a woman named Eloise, who rarely spoke above a whisper, turned to her with wide eyes. You're the one from the news, aren't you?" Margaret offered a small, wry smile. "I suppose I am." Another resident, Harold, an ex-journalist who spent most of his days arguing with crossword puzzles, stood up and clapped once, then twice. The room followed. The room. Margaret blushed. She hadn't worn recognition in so long it felt like stepping into clothes from another life. But something inside her straightened. Her spine, once curled with grief, felt tall again. They didn't look at her with pity anymore. They looked at her with reverence. In a secure conference room within the Charleston FBI field office, a stack of papers sat under protective glass, each sheet numbered, each signature verified, each timestamp matched to phone logs, emails, public statements. Margaret's handwriting was clean, legible, almost clinical in its precision. 3 agents sat around the table, including lead investigator Rachel Kim, a woman known for her zero-tolerance approach to public sector corruption. She flipped through the evidence slowly, her lips pursed. "These aren't musings," she said. "They're chronologically aligned, behaviorally accurate, and strategically useful. Whoever wrote this knows how to build a case." Her colleague, a data forensics analyst, nodded. "Everything cross-checks. The student names don't exist. The quoted language appears across multiple files submitted to Grantworth. 2 of the essays were copy-pasted with just name swaps." Rachel tapped her pen on the table. "What about the motive? Why would the whistleblower do this?" "She's the mother of one of the directors." Rachel raised an eyebrow, and still came forward. "She was institutionalized against her will." That caught the room's attention. Another agent leaned forward. They silenced her, and she documented them anyway. Rachel turned back to the files. "She's not just a witness, she's a damn compass." She closed the file gently and stood. "Bring the mother in, quietly, respectfully. She's no longer just a footnote." Back at Rolling Pines, Margaret sat beneath the shade of the East Garden's elm trees. The world around her was blooming again, even if faintly smiles from staff, nods from residents, a fresh notebook left on her tray at breakfast, with a ribbon tied neatly around it. She hadn't asked for admiration, but it came, like rain after drought. As she turned a page in her current journal, a breeze caught the corner, flipping back to her entry from the day she arrived here. "I am not broken, I am buried." She smiled faintly, then took a pen and wrote beneath it, "Now I rise." It was a Thursday when the headlines broke. Owen Nolan arrested in federal education fraud case. Charleston philanthropy scandal widens. Son of esteemed professor in custody. Justice begins where silence ends. The morning air in Charleston was thick with humidity and the hum of sirens. Federal agents arrived at the Nolan estate just past dawn. There were no dramatic chases, no banging on doors, just a sharp knock, a warrant, and a slow, defeated walk down the front steps. Owen Nolan emerged in a navy button-down shirt, slightly wrinkled, the top collar undone. He didn't struggle, didn't speak, just kept his eyes to the pavement as they cuffed him and guided him into the back of a waiting vehicle. Across the street, a local reporter's camera zoomed in on the scene, catching the flash of metal around his wrists, the faint bruise-colored shadows beneath his eyes. Inside the SUV, Owen sat stone still, jaw clenched so tightly it clicked. They hadn't called to warn him this time. Victoria had disappeared. His mother had become a symbol, and now it was his name that would be dragged across every chyron, every front page. By mid-afternoon he was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and within hours his arraignment was scheduled for the following morning. The courthouse steps were lined with bodies. Press, protesters, former colleagues, curious onlookers. Whispers ran through the crowd like electricity. Inside the hearing room was packed. Margaret watched the feed from Rolling Pines, her heart still, her face unreadable. She wore a gray shawl over her shoulders, and her hands rested calmly in her lap, though her fingertips tapped an almost imperceptible rhythm against her notebook. "Is that really him?" whispered Eloise, who sat beside her, squinting at the screen. "Yes," Margaret replied softly. "That's my son." The screen cut to Owen entering the courtroom. He looked older, more drawn. The lines around his mouth were deeper, and his eyes scanned the room like someone searching for a trap door. As he sat at the defense table, the lead prosecutor stood and began the litany of charges. Conspiracy to commit fraud submission of falsified documents to a federally funded institution, laundering of grant monies through fabricated identities, and obstruction of justice. Each word landed with a thud. The defense attorney, a sharp-suited man named Eric Clemens, rose. He adjusted his tie, his voice calm. "Your Honor, the defendant maintains that the allegations against him are based on deeply flawed testimony and are the product of personal vendetta. We intend to demonstrate that this case is not about deliberate fraud, but about confusion, mental illness, and family breakdown." Margaret's mouth tightened. She knew what was coming. The attorney continued. The primary evidence was compiled by the defendant's mother, who at the time of compiling said materials was under psychological evaluation for paranoid tendencies and cognitive deterioration. We submit that her credibility must be weighed accordingly. A murmur rippled through the court. Margaret exhaled once slowly, like releasing a blade from its sheath. An hour later, the judge ordered that physical evidence be submitted for review. That was when the doors at the rear of the courtroom opened and Halbert walked in. He was a quiet storm in a sea of noise, no coat, just a briefcase, firm grip, sharp eyes. He approached the prosecution bench with a stack of files and a declaration of chain of custody. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "I submit notarized dated documents supported by third-party witnesses, forensic metadata, and corroborating institutional timelines. These are not ramblings. These are records." He held up a leather-bound volume, the original journal, Margaret's first notebook. She didn't write this in a fugue. She wrote this like an archivist, like a prosecutor, like a mother whose son had traded truth for convenience. The judge gestured him forward. Halbert approached and handed the notebook directly to the clerk. "This isn't speculation," he added. "It's testimony, and it's time you heard it." They called her in the next morning. Margaret received the call just before breakfast. Clara knocked gently on her door and entered with a quiet, measured smile. "They've requested you," she said. Margaret looked up from her book letters to a young contrarian and set it aside. "Today, they'll send a car. I'll need a suit." Clara nodded. "It's already pressed." The courthouse smelled of old stone and too much perfume. Inside the hearing room, people rose when she entered, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't help it. She wore navy blue. Her cane tapped softly against the floor as she walked slow, deliberate, dignified. She did not look at Owen. She did not look at the audience. She looked only at the bench where justice waited. The bailiff swore her in. Her voice was strong. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I've waited months to do so," she replied. There was a pause as she settled into the witness chair. Then the prosecutor approached. "Dr. Nolan, would you please state your relationship to the defendant?" Margaret's eyes never flinched. "I am his mother. Can you explain in your own words how you came to discover irregularities within the Nolan Foundation?" "I listened," she said. "I paid attention. I read the documents they thought I'd never touch. I remembered every inconsistency, every contradiction. Then I wrote them down." The attorney handed her a folder. "Do you recognize these?" "Yes, they're mine." "And what were your intentions when you began recording this information?" "I wanted to preserve the truth. because they were building something on lies and no one else seemed willing to see it. The defense stood. Dr. Nolan Clemens began, voice like ice wrapped in silk. "You've been diagnosed with cognitive decline, have you not?" "I've been accused of cognitive decline," Margaret said, "by the people who had something to lose. Do you have medical records stating otherwise?" "No, but I have this." She held up her hand. "Everything I wrote clearly, chronologically, consistently. If I were losing my mind, the patterns would have broken, but they didn't. They got sharper." There was silence. Then the prosecutor stepped forward again. "Dr. Nolan, why didn't you go to the authorities sooner?" "Because I was locked away," she said, her voice tightening. "Because my son signed papers that stripped me of autonomy. Because my daughter-in-law drugged my tea and called it therapy. Because no one wanted to believe that a woman of my age still had value." Her gaze turned slowly to Owen. "And because the one person who should have known better looked the other way." Owen dropped his eyes. When she stepped down, the room did not clap, but they didn't need to. The weight of her words remained long after her footsteps faded down the hallway. And in the days that followed, the court would deliberate, the press would swarm, and prosecutors would prepare their full charges. But in that moment, Margaret Nolan, frail silence dismissed, had faced down the very boy she raised and the institution he tried to hide behind. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't wept. She'd simply told the truth, and it had shattered the room. The courtroom held its breath. Dust particles drifted through the sunbeam, slicing across the benches, catching in the golden light, like remnants of some ancient reckoning. A room built for procedure now pulsed with something raw, expectation maybe, or reckoning. Margaret Nolan stood once more. She didn't ask to speak. She simply rose as if summoned by some force beyond protocol, and the judge, seeing her, gave a small nod. No gavel, no objection, just silence folding open to receive her words. She turned to face the room. Her son sat hunched beside his lawyer, eyes vacant, face paler than marble. Across the aisle, the media sat with pens poised and cameras rolling, hungry for something sensational. But Margaret wasn't giving them scandal. She was giving them truth. "My son," she began, voice calm, unhurried, chose silence. The sentence cut through the room like a blade. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was something in the cadence of her words, measured, deliberate, bone-deep, that made every head lean forward. He chose to look away when the truth grew inconvenient, when greed whispered louder than memory, louder than ethics, louder than blood. She paused. A breath. Then, "I did not." There it was. Not an accusation, not a cry, a line drawn in the air between them. Margaret continued. "I did not choose to be silenced. I was confined, misdiagnosed, called unstable by the very people who knew I was sane. But still I did not stop. I wrote. I remembered. I watched. Because that's what justice is. It isn't loud. It's relentless." The judge watched her unmoving. Even the stenographer's hands slowed. Margaret's gaze drifted across the room, catching the eyes of strangers who had followed her story like readers of a serialized epic. People who had never met her but somehow knew her, who saw in her not a fragile woman but a lighthouse standing through a storm. She turned back to Owen. "There was a time," she said softly, "when you came home crying because another boy cheated on a spelling test and got praised for it. You said it wasn't fair. You were 9. You were right." She swallowed the emotion that tried to rise. "You were right then, and you could have been again." Her voice cracked just once at the end. Then she returned to her seat, her cane tapping once, then again, then silence. The judge shifted in his chair. His eyes scanned the room before dropping to the documents in front of him. He cleared his throat, but even that sounded like a funeral bell. In reviewing the evidence presented, both physical and testimonial, it is the court's finding that the defendant Owen Nolan knowingly and willfully participated in a scheme to defraud a federally funded educational institution for personal gain. He paused. This court recognizes the compelling testimony of Dr. Margaret Nolan, whose documentation, despite efforts to discredit her, has proven crucial in the uncovering of systemic deception and financial abuse. Owen looked down, jaw tight. The judge continued. For the charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, submission of falsified documents, and obstruction of justice, The court hereby sentences the defendant to 10 years in federal custody. A collective gasp rolled through the gallery. Margaret closed her eyes. Furthermore, the judge added the court hereby nullifies all power of attorney privileges previously granted to the defendant over the person and estate of Dr. Margaret Nolan and issues a permanent protective injunction preventing the reactivation of such control. He flipped to a final page. Additionally, this court authorizes the seizure and freezing of assets linked to fraudulent disbursements, including but not limited to bank accounts under the Nolan Foundation, pending investigation into tax evasion and possible co-conspirators. There was a beat of silence. Then the gavel came down once. Final. 3 hours later, an international arrest warrant was issued for Victoria Nolan. Interpol's red notice flashed across databases in 27 countries. Airports flagged her passport. Border alerts were renewed. She had become the ghost in a network of systems designed to hunt shadows, and though no one yet knew where she'd gone, they all knew she was running out of time. Back in Charleston, the storm settled, but not into calm, into clarity. As Margaret stepped out of the courthouse, a sea of people waited. They lined the steps, the sidewalk, the block. Some held cameras, others signs that read, "Believe women, at any age, and truth has no expiration date." She didn't wave, she didn't grandstand, but when someone shouted, "Thank you, Dr. Nolan," she turned and for the briefest moment allowed herself to smile. Not wide, not victorious, but true. A young woman in her 20s pushed gently to the front of the crowd and pressed a handwritten letter into Margaret's hand. "My grandmother said you reminded her of herself," the girl whispered, before she stopped fighting. Margaret looked at the letter, then at the girl. Then maybe she said it's time she started again. Cameras flashed, but her eyes, deep, steady, ocean dark, remained fixed ahead. Later that week, Halberd sat in his office desk piled with manila folders, copies of affidavits, deposition drafts. The case wasn't over, it had only widened. But amid the chaos, one envelope stood out, cream-colored, embossed, from the acquisitions editor of a major publishing house. He opened it slowly. "We followed the story closely. Dr. Nolan's handwritten testimony is a landmark artifact, part literature, part legal case, file, part manifesto. We would be honored to discuss the opportunity of turning her journals into a published volume. We propose the working title, The Shards of Silence." Halberd chuckled quietly. He reached for his phone. "Clara," he said when she answered, "I need you to ask Margaret something." "What's that?" He leaned back in his chair, eyes twinkling. "If she's ready to be read by the world." At Rolling Pines, Margaret sat beneath the same elm where she had written her first post-institution page. The leaves above rustled with late summer promise. Clara approached slowly, holding out the letter. Margaret read it. Then she looked out across the courtyard where Eloise and Harold played chess under a canopy. In the distance, someone played Chopin on an old upright piano. "I never wanted to be famous," she said. "You're not," Clara smiled. "You're necessary." Margaret let out a breath, then nodded once. "Tell them yes." She picked up her pen again. There were still things to write, and this time she would sign them with her name, in full, for everyone to see. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped in among the usual stack of magazine subscriptions and medical pamphlets. Clara spotted it first. White envelope, prison-stamped, the handwriting hesitant, uncertain as though each word had been weighed before being written. It was from Owen. Clara set it on Margaret's side table without comment. She didn't ask whether the letter would be read or whether it should have even been delivered. Some things were sacred. Some silences deserved their own space. That evening after dinner, Margaret sat in her chair by the window as the Colorado dusk curled over the horizon. She picked up the envelope, turned it over twice in her hands, and then placed it unopened inside a drawer. No rage, no ceremony. Just quiet refusal. She had heard enough from Owen for one lifetime. Word had gotten around Charleston. The professor had turned down her son's house. Not just turned it down, refused without hesitation the formal offer from Owen's extended family to return to the Nolan estate. The lawyers wrote in polished language, promised renovations, personal care, even financial incentives. Margaret didn't even let Halberd read the letter aloud. "I'm not going back," she said. "They don't get to rewrite the ending." Instead, she boarded a train westward, alone. Denver welcomed her like a city that had been waiting. The air was different there. Cleaner, yes, but freer. Less filled with the residue of memory. The community she chose sat just outside the city limits, tucked against the slope of a hill, where sunlight poured over rooftops like honey. Silver Pines Living Collective. Not a nursing home, not an institution. A cooperative of seniors who had decided they were not done living. Margaret walked its curved paths on her first morning, breathing in wildflowers and the scent of brewing coffee from the shared kitchens. Here no one asked about Charleston. No one whispered about the trial. They only asked what she wanted for breakfast, and whether she'd be willing to lead a discussion on Plato. It began with a flyer, typed in bold black letters and posted on the message board next to the dining hall. Ageless Thinking, a new weekly philosophy group for anyone with curiosity and caffeine, led by Margaret Nolan, Fridays at 3 p.m. in the West Sunroom. She expected maybe 3 attendees. 11 showed up. Harold brought a notebook filled with underlined Kant. Teresa arrived in a wheelchair with her nurse and a dog-eared copy of Meditations. A former school principal named Bernice brought oatmeal cookies and a folder of questions written in fountain pen ink. Margaret walked into that first session with no notes, just a question. What does it mean, she asked, when silence becomes betrayal? The room fell still. Then slowly, conversation bloomed, uncertain at first, like saplings testing spring air. But by the end of the hour, people were raising hands, debating, remembering long-forgotten arguments from college lectures, tracing philosophy back to their own lives, like rivers back to their source. One man wept while recounting the moment he hadn't spoken up when his sister was forced into a care home. Teresa spoke of the years she'd spent allowing her doctor to over-medicate her, fearing confrontation. Bernice admitted that for over a decade she hadn't told her family she hated Sundays, because she was always expected to host. I thought it was selfish, she said, but now I think it was cowardice. Margaret didn't judge them. She simply nodded and wrote one sentence on the whiteboard. Silence is not always neutral. Week by week the sessions grew. What began as a quiet discussion turned into a gathering of minds hungry for something more than bingo and meal schedules. Margaret invited them to read Seneca, to debate Simone Weil, to wrestle with the moral weight of watching versus acting. They called it a philosophy circle, but really it was something else, a reclamation. One afternoon, Margaret returned to her apartment to find a package on her doorstep. No return label, just her name in block letters. Inside was a galley proof of her upcoming book, The Shards of Silence, by Margaret Nolan. She sat down slowly, ran her fingers along the spine, and opened to the dedication page. For those who were never asked, and for those who were asked to forget. She didn't cry, but she did close the book and hold it against her chest, as if steadying something too big to name. During the 6th week of ageless thinking, Margaret arrived to find the chairs already arranged in a wide circle, a pot of tea at the center. Harold raised his hand before she could begin. I've been thinking, he said, voice gravelly but firm. Maybe it wasn't my fault, not speaking up about my daughter's marriage. Maybe I thought silence was protection. It often masquerades as that, Margaret said. But it wasn't, was it? No, she replied. It rarely is. The room nodded as if breathing in unison. Then Bernice asked, Do you think silence is always cowardice? Margaret smiled. Not always. Sometimes it's survival, sometimes it's wisdom. But the moment it becomes avoidance, it begins to rot. They sat with that for a while. Later, as they poured tea and flipped through pages of the Republic, Margaret caught herself watching their faces, not for comprehension but for something else. Awakening. She had seen it in her students once, decades ago, when ideas sparked into lives. Now she saw it again, not in young people with futures, but in the aged, whose voices the world had started to tune out. Here those voices were roaring back. Margaret didn't miss Charleston. Not the house, not the prestige, not the hollow performance of status. She missed her roses, yes, but even they, she suspected, had already forgotten her. What she had now was something different. Purpose, yes, but more than that perspective. For too long she'd carried the weight of being a victim, of being erased, of fighting to be heard in a room that had already locked its doors. Now she walked freely under the Colorado sun among people who listened not out of obligation, but out of belief. She was no longer a mother pleading for redemption. She was a teacher again, and this time no one was grading her. The invitation came in a sleek black envelope delivered by courier to Silver Pines just after breakfast. Clara found it wedged between a stack of pharmacy mailers and a care package of dried figs. She turned it over, read the gold-embossed logo, and smiled. Civic Voice, a national broadcast on ethics and accountability, featuring Americans who refuse to stay silent. Margaret read the letter quietly, her tea cooling beside her. They wanted her to speak, on camera, in front of a live studio audience, national syndication. They offered a car, a hotel, makeup wardrobe, the works. She folded the letter once, then again, then slid it back into the envelope and set it aside. That Friday, instead of a lecture hall or studio lights, Margaret rolled the TV into the center of the Ageless Thinking Circle, the weekly philosophy group she'd founded for her fellow residents. Harold tried to fix the static, but Margaret waved him off. "No need," she said. "Today's message doesn't need polishing." In the middle of the room sat Clara's camcorder balanced on 3 hardcover books. Margaret adjusted her shawl, looked into the lens, and waited for the red light to blink. "When I was 29, she began, her voice warm but deliberate. I told a classroom full of students that silence was the ultimate failure of a thinking mind." She paused. "I don't believe that anymore." The room leaned in, breath held. Silence can be inherited, forced, woven into you by those who fear what your voice might do. Her gaze held steady. "But there's a difference between not speaking and not being heard." Margaret leaned slightly forward, her voice lower now. "Not everyone can shout. Not everyone has the strength or the stage. But everyone can speak. Even if it's just to say, 'I was there.'" A small smile. "And sometimes that's enough to change everything." The camera blinked off. Applause filled the room, not loud but deeply felt. The network aired her video a week later. They didn't touch a frame. They kept the camcorder's fixed angle, the ambient echoes of the sunroom, even the scratchy audio. The unpolished honesty of it cut deeper than any prepared statement could. It reached hospital rooms, small-town living rooms, halfway houses, and nursing homes across the country. And something remarkable happened. People listened. That same night, in a dusty Arizona border town, a woman in a beige sun hat was asked by Border Patrol to step aside. She handed over a French passport and alias and claimed she was headed to a health retreat in Baja. The officer scanned it, then asked her to remove her sunglasses. She hesitated, but a fingerprint scan doesn't hesitate. 30 seconds later, the red alert flashed. Victoria Nolan was arrested without incident. Inside her luggage, $7,400 in cash, 3 burner phones, a stack of prepaid SIM cards, and a single book, Margaret's published journal, The Shards of Silence. She didn't say a word. By morning, she was in federal custody. Back in Denver, the mail began to arrive in waves. It started as a trickle, 3 letters, then 7, then dozens, some typed, many handwritten in shaky script, some anonymous, some with pressed flowers, some with tear stains. They came from Montana, Arkansas, Kansas, and Queens, from women in hospice, from veterans, from quiet men who had lost the nerve to speak up years ago, from daughters who'd watched their mothers be silenced, from sons who hadn't called home until now. One note read, "You reminded me I had something left to say. I didn't know I needed to say it." Another, "When my son said I was too old to understand the world now, I mailed him your book. He hasn't stopped calling since." Clara began pinning them up on Margaret's wall, stringing yarn between cities on a map, a living tribute to every voice she had unlocked. Margaret read each one, not as a savior, but as a listener. And every morning she whispered to them, "I hear you." On the first snow of December, Margaret sat by the window as light flurries fell across the Silver Pines courtyard. The elm was bare, the garden silent. In her lap rested a brand-new leather journal, not a legal ledger, not a weapon, something gentler. She opened to the first page and began writing. "To those who believe they are too old to matter, too late to act, or too small to be remembered." Her pen moved smoothly, each letter a promise. "There is no expiration date on your voice, no time limit on courage. You are not a leftover. You are a beginning." She paused, took a sip of tea, then continued, "I am no longer writing to survive. I am writing so that others might begin. The ageless thinking group grew larger than the room could hold. They moved it to the chapel next door where sunlight pooled through stained glass and chairs creaked with every new arrival. People didn't come to be taught. They came to remember what it felt like to speak, what it meant to be heard. Margaret didn't count the days anymore. She didn't track headlines. She didn't reread the court records. She sat in the quiet under snowlight and wrote like she had all the time in the world. Because now she understood. Time wasn't something that ran out. It was something you filled. One word, one echo, one breath of truth at a time. The community center in downtown Denver wasn't built for elegance. It was built for echoes. On the winter night of its anniversary celebration, the main hall had been cleared of folding chairs and craft tables to make space for something softer, music light and belonging. Candles lined the windows. Quilts draped the walls. And in the middle of it all stood a makeshift wooden stage, just high enough for voices to rise above the noise of memory. They called it the Evening of Voices. No microphones. No grand performances, just a piano, a cello, and 30 aging voices once buried beneath silence, now singing with something stronger than melody. They sang Let No Voice Be Silent. The lyrics were simple, almost naive, but the way they sang them, slow, imperfect, cracked at the edges, carried the weight of lives that had seen too much, lost too much, and still chose to speak. Margaret sat in the front row wrapped in her navy shawl. Her eyes shimmered, not from sentiment, but resonance. She didn't sing. She listened, because tonight others were singing what she once had to write alone. After the final note drifted into stillness, the applause came not loud but long. Some clapped, some wept, some simply held hands. Margaret stood to leave quietly. But just as she turned, she felt arms wrap around her shoulders from behind. She froze, then heard a whisper. I never got to say thank you. She turned. It was Clara. Her hair was shorter now, touched with soft streaks of silver. Her eyes glistened behind thick-rimmed glasses. And when Margaret embraced her, it wasn't the reunion of heroine and witness. It was the homecoming of two women who once faced darkness together and lived. They held each other for a long time. I followed every letter, Clara whispered. I watched every broadcast. Margaret smiled. I figured you'd moved on. I did, Clara said, because you made it safe to. Weeks later, the letter came on embossed paper, official, overpraised and scented faintly with formality. It was from the National Elder Advocacy Council. They wanted Margaret to attend their spring conference in Washington, D.C., as keynote guest, with a medal, and a title Guardian of Truth National Elder Voice Award. Clara read it aloud as Margaret stirred her tea. Margaret didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window, watching a squirrel dart across the snow. Finally, she said, they want to reward the noise, but it wasn't the noise that saved me. Clara blinked. So you'll decline? I'll go, Margaret said. But I'm not accepting a title. Clara smiled. What will you accept? Margaret took a sip of tea. A chair, she said, at the table, with the others who still think no one's listening. They gave her the stage anyway. At the podium, surrounded by press cameras and lobbyists, Margaret looked strangely small and utterly unshakable. She told no stories, shared no tears. She simply looked out over the sea of faces and said, I am not here because I screamed the loudest. I am here because someone finally stopped pretending not to hear. Then she stepped down. Later that day, she signed on as senior advisor to the council's new community justice education program. Her job, to help design ethical literacy workshops in public schools and senior centers. To speak not as a victim but as a mentor. To build curriculum around the very thing they tried to take from her, voice. She returned to Denver quiet, content. The news articles slowed. The letters from strangers became fewer. The book royalties were donated in full to fund legal services for elderly abuse victims. And still, every Friday, Margaret sat in the same circle, ageless thinking, where they now tackled themes like forgiveness, legacy, and what comes after truth. She didn't need to lead anymore. Others had found their voices. Harold ran sessions on stoicism. Teresa, now mobile with a walker, curated weekly debates. Margaret mostly listened, occasionally nodded, and once in a while gently corrected a misquoted Descartes. That spring, the halls of Silver Pines flooded with gold. Sunlight returned to the garden. Bees traced lazy arcs through the lavender bushes. Wheelchairs rolled more slowly now, not from weight but from savoring. And Margaret, she walked. Not far, not fast, but without hesitation. One morning she moved through the west hallway where light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, brushing the walls with liquid amber. Her steps were measured cane-tapping softly. The hallway stretched long and empty, but her voice steady and sure narrated softly into the stillness. When we are alive, she said, silence is not a sanctuary. Her fingers grazed the wood-paneled railing. It is a trap. She stopped beneath a beam of light and closed her eyes. And I, she whispered, have finally escaped. She opened her eyes, then continued forward, one step at a time, into whatever came next.